In the biointensive method of those 40 beds, remember we were talking about the 4,000 square feet, which is 4,100 square foot beds? More than 2/3 of those beds are only used to grow fertility for your garden, to maintain it. So the darker green ones are the beds where you're actually growing crops that you're going to eat. And all the other beds are for growing fertility, to maintain the system and keep nurturing it and making sure that you can do it year after year after year. I was on the radio, I do a lot of radio and starting to do television to promote living sustainably. And I had a gentleman call me on the phone and he said, my garden was doing great for a couple of years and then all of a sudden it stopped producing, and I'm really wondering if it was chemtrails, that the government's flying over and messing with my garden. And what I really think it is he wasn't putting enough fertility back in there. You know, you've got to keep maintaining that fertility and putting the rabbit manure in, or the horse manure, or whatever you can come up with. And one of the great things, just to give you kind of another idea about the biointensive method, is it really is a complete method. And a lot of us say, well, you got to put more fertility back in there. We go, well, how much? I mean, what are you talking about, shovelful or what? Well, you know, the biointensive people have said, yes, this is exactly what you need. You need 6 buckets of compost, 5-gallon buckets for 100 square foot bed. So I love that they use something in such practical terms that I'm going to have around the house. So a 5-gallon bucket I can measure things with. So what do I eat? And by the way, a lot of people want to know, about half of my diet comes from the land. And you know, I could do more, but quite frankly, I'm a wife, a homeschooling mom, a community activist, and I've got a small business of promoting and selling DVDs, so I don't have all the time I'd like to. I spend about 10 to 20 hours a week growing my own food, this is pretty much what I'm eating right now. Some of that is stuff I've grown and stored, and a lot of it is just fresh. One really interesting thing to note on the imported stuff, chocolate. I'm addicted to chocolate. I'll go ahead and confess that I'm going to start going to meetings soon. Although, I don't know if I'm really ready to give up that addiction. Actually, that's why I went to Central America. So I'm passionate about living sustainably, and I thought, well, let's go where chocolate grows, you know. My family wasn't going to move there, unfortunately. I would have gone in a heartbeat. But anyway, the 2 big items there are avocados and butter. And it turns out that growing fats are one of the more difficult things to grow. If we go back real quickly to this, well, we can go to this one, to this chart with the 4,100 square foot beds in the biointensive method. This diet, by the way, is very low fat and very Spartan. This is very much a survival diet. It does meet your needs for protein and carbohydrates and fat and nutrition. It definitely does, but it is a very Spartan diet. So let's talk about getting started. And what are some of the things that you can go do right now, because you need to go do them. I'm very serious about this crisis coming. You will see it more and more in the headlines about and some of the red flags when you hear more about food riots going on in some of these poorer nations. And when you start seeing more food prices increasing, and when you hear about the price of oil going up, and when you hear about some bad weather. We're having a drought right now in the western United States, and our hard red winter wheat crop is being, it's just not being able to grow. Or wheat production is not going to be good this year. We absolutely need to get going on this. So first of all, start buying your backup food supplies, and remember Survival Blog and the Survival Podcast, and we'll get Harlan to bring in some more resources on that too. Start working on that. But the most important thing is start a compost pile, because really fertility is the key. Lots of resources on how to do that also, but and you can, even if you're living in an apartment, you can get a little bucket and put it under the sink. And I promise you, a compost pile that's being handled well and being taken care of only pretty much smells like rich earth. It doesn't have, if it's starting to smell funky, that's actually telling you something's wrong. So you can do this even in an apartment. And certainly if you've got a yard or more land than that, go out and start a compost pile. Another recommendation is start small. Oh my God, my husband is very fortunate. His grandmother grew up growing food, And Nanny always had a garden. It was huge. It was an acre. And she fed her family. She fed the community. That woman could produce food. So when we moved out, my husband said, we had probably more resources, which is a bad thing. If you only have less resources, it's probably a good thing. He said, "Hon, I'm going to plow you up an acre." And we did. And we had an acre of weeds and frustration. It's just too much land. Start small. 50 square feet, 100 square feet. Get to where you're doing good with that, and then expand it each season with something more as you go along. And for those of you in apartments, there's lots of land around. One of the Dell brothers has created a website talking about how you can share, somebody who has a backyard they're not using, and you can grow a garden there. I got to get the name of that website, but just do some Googling and you'll find it. Community garden areas have plots available. Most organic farmers actually don't own their land. They usually lease it or rent it from someone else. So there's lots of options. And even if you are in an apartment, just get a few plants and put them in the windowsill. Basil growing and rosemary. Those guys are pretty industrial strength. And start developing a relationship with them and the habit. In the beginning, like I can tell you a typical scenario, you buy a couple of plants, you put them in the window, and you're working with them, and you're like noticing when they get droopy and when they need water, or when you fertilize them too much. You start looking and realizing what they look like. You're learning. Those are very valuable skills. And then you get wrapped up in something, hopefully it's a romance, but most likely it's going to be a project from work. And you come back and like a week later or 2 weeks later, and you forgot all about those plants and they are dead. Well, just take a deep breath and put that in the compost pile, start over again, and just realize you're trying to develop the habit of looking at your food sources every day and taking care of them. It's a new habit. It's a new thing that you're forming. So, it's a new lifestyle that you're taking on. Mel Bartholomew has a book called Square Foot Gardening. I'm pretty sure they got it out here in the bookstore. Excellent, excellent resource about very small gardens and how to start small. Also, and now it's wintertime in a lot of places in the country, and you can't get outside as well as we can here in Central Texas. You start networking. A lot of times gardening clubs are still meeting. Start to hang out with other people who know how to grow food. Maybe join a permaculture group. The Transition Town movement is all about preparing different cities for energy descent, and they have wonderful resources. 4-H is open to adults, and you don't have to be a kid to be in 4-H, and they have a lot of resources, especially on growing livestock. So there's a lot of things to do, and highly recommend even if you just drive by and you notice your neighbor has a garden, give them a little gift and introduce yourself and say, "I've driven by your garden, a couple of times, and I just could wonder if you could show me a little bit. What are you growing?" Your neighbors and the local people around you are going to be your best source of information for what varieties to plant and how to handle the weather that's coming up. So let's do a quick review. Good speaker always tells you what you're going to hear, tells you what it is, and then reviews it at the end. And so we talked a little bit about me, and then we talked a little bit about the food prices, and they have been going up. You can expect food prices to keep increasing at an exponential rate, and until, of course, the whole thing collapses. And yes, I'm talking about hyperinflation and currency collapse is in the cards. I don't think there's any doubt about that anymore, except for maybe most of America. Distribution. We have this huge centralized distribution system that gives us incredible vulnerability. And then our production is America is not the breadbasket to the world anymore. We just don't grow a huge amount of food that's excess. So some of the factors affecting the prices: the weather, the price of oil, and government interventions. I don't expect any of those things to change. Now, if we suddenly get perfect weather, the price of oil goes down, and the government starts behaving reasonably, I don't think there's a chance of any of those happening. But if they do, then no, your grocery bill is not going to double. But I think based on all of those, it's very conservative, and I hope it only doubles. So what can you do? We talked about storing food, and then we talked about growing food. Growing food is ultimately the solution. We talked a little bit about how much land and how much water you need, and some of the real basics. just to kind of get you started, and then a few ideas to where you can go from there. Now, you know, we foresaw that this crisis would come almost a decade ago, and you know, quite frankly, you can get a lot done when you're living in panic. It is true, and I've been working very, very hard all these years to figure out what is the best way to go about producing calories. And we basically took everything that we've learned. We used to teach it in a one-day workshop, and then those things were getting so booked and so overbooked, and you know, I couldn't quite keep up with the presentation level on that. We ended up turning it all into a DVD. This is not something that was slapped together on YouTube. This is something we spent months and months writing the script, doing the shoot, and then months and months of editing. It's crafted. It's 110 minutes of video, and then there's a CD-ROM with a whole bunch of documents. So I talk about the importance of fertility, and then we have 3 or 4 documents on different ways to do worm composting, or you know, animal parts composting, or different ways to compost. We have a book on seed saving. We have a whole series of permaculture design notes from Bill Mollison, how to tan a rabbit skin. There's a whole bunch of resources in there. Yes. So also we have a free newsletter, which you're welcome to sign up for, and you can cover some great topics. Free fertilizer, you know, how much land do you need? I go in a lot more depth on that whole bit. You can sign up there. And then as a final bit, these are my kids. And if I can leave you with one parting thought, and you know, there are pockets of our government, and there are pockets of our industrial complex, and there are even pockets of our military that are still functioning and serving the people. But by and large, those organizations are corrupt, and they're decaying, and they don't serve us anymore. And the solutions to these problems are going to come from me, and they're going to come from you. They're going to come from the people. They are not going to come from, you know, FEMA is not going to come and take care of you. The problems are just too big. It is something that you need to do. And the more that we all start doing this and learning new techniques and sharing them with each other, the better off we're going to be. But if I can leave you with that one final thought, and that is that the solutions are going to come from us. So thank you so much for being here. And I want to thank Harlan and Brave New Books again for sponsoring this talk. And we'll continue on here with a little bit of a question and answer session. But thank you again. So.